Good evening, everybody. Tonight is the 11th official SWOG webinar. Tonight, we are very fortunate to be joined by Paul Moseley. It's fair to say he enjoys surrounding himself with nature. He has been a countryside ranger, a forest school practitioner, then a trainer for that, and trained many people to do that. He set up the Centre for Ethnoecology, and he is currently doing a master's. We're very lucky that he has time for us, and lucky that connecting and collaborating with others and spreading his knowledge is something that he enjoys. So I'll pass over to you, Paul, because you can do a better intro for yourself than I could.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I started off in social forestry and slowly worked my way into lots of different positions. I actually did a master's last year. I'm actually now working on a PhD in what's called ethnoecology. So Sarah gets 10 out of 10 points for being able to say the word. That's usually the biggest sort of stumbling block for people. But ethnoecology is looking at how individuals, how communities perceive and relate to what we call the more than human. And the reason why we use such a clunky term like that is that nature has a particular meaning to it, has a particular aesthetic to it, and we're trying to understand behind all of the assumptions we have about the natural world. But this evening, I offered to give a talk about one of the tools that we've used over the years for many different kinds of habitats that is a way of kind of simplifying what might be a very complicated way of trying to think about how do we actually steward the land, how do we manage the land, and obviously in this particular conversation this evening, looking at woodland. So the plan is that I'm going to be waffling away for 45 minutes or so. Obviously, there's a presentation here that you can see, and I'll make the presentation available so Sarah can send it off to everybody that would like a copy. And then we're going to have sort of 10-15 minutes at the end, question and answer. But also I'll make sure everyone's got my email and website details as well, so that if there's something you want to follow up on, then you've got sort of direct access to me. Right then. So, like I said, I've been involved with lots and lots of different habitats, from heathland to very formal parkland, to ancient forests, to new planted forests. And it's very easy to get lost in the complexity and get confused by all of the different interactions that are happening. And I was fortunate enough to have been taught this succession model quite early on, I think when I was a countryside ranger. And essentially what it does is it boils down all of the very many options that are available to you to essentially 5. And you're doing one of those 5 things in different areas. So, well, this is where technology lets us down. There we go. So what is succession then? So basically it's about one habitat turning into another. So by habitat, we can also mean a woodland with a certain species mix turning into a woodland with a different species mix. But essentially, it's over a period of time, how does one habitat become something slightly different? Now, there's obviously various ways that that can happen. It can happen over different periods of time. When I was a forest school trainer, we used to teach people how to do surveys, phase 1 surveys, impact assessments, etc. And when we got to the management plan, what was really interesting is that because a lot of them had come from a teaching background, the idea of looking 3 years in advance to think about woodlands was quite alien to them. And so I gave them this perspective of, well, actually, when I've been working in forestry and countryside management, we need to think more or less in 50 to 100 years. So yeah, the perception of the speed at which things can happen is very interesting. So you could have a transition whereby a piece of grassland starts to become pioneer woodland within 5 years. Obviously, when we're looking at things like ancient woodlands, we're looking at hundreds of years. So the speed of any kind of transition is a very important defining characteristic. And when we mean succession, obviously, like I say, we're talking about this change. And ultimately, if you start with cut grass, let it grow, eventually it will become an ancient woodland hundreds of years from now. But within that, there are lots of small cycles of succession as well. And what it helps us do is it helps us recognize what is our role, what is it we're trying to do, and to have a real clarity about that. And ultimately, we're thinking about what is the health, what is the ability of the woodland to be resilient to whatever pressures are placed on it. Obviously, if we were to go back a few centuries, we would have huge sprawling woodlands where they would all be going through these various forms of succession, where you'd have ancient woodlands in some, you'd have decaying woodland in others, you'd have new woodlands starting up somewhere else. Obviously, as agriculture and industry has developed the land, they're now all fragmented. And so whilst we do need to think about the bigger picture, a lot of times we're actually looking at a particular piece of woodland, or even a small compartment within that as well. So why do we want to think about some kind of management technique? So obviously we've got biodiversity. One of the things we could be looking at is a habitat changing from something of low biodiversity value to something of higher biodiversity value? I was actually visiting a site today where back in the 70s or so, in a bit of area near to some residential, near a residential area, they planted sycamore. Now, sycamore's pretty fast growing. It's a short fibered species, which can be fairly sort of brittle in storms. But the biodiversity value of it, the invertebrate value, that is the number of different insects that live off it, is fairly low. It's about 42, 50, something like that. But when we get into something like the oak, which is very much the backbone of the ecology, or certainly the woodland ecology in this country, you're into the nearly 500 different species. So recognizing that trees do have different invertebrate values, different contributions to biodiversity, and the invertebrate number is just one example of that, is important in recognizing what is the overall health value of your woodland, and as you notice how it's changing, whether that's increasing or maybe decreasing. Obviously, we've got adaptation to climate change as well. So we do have average temperatures increasing. What we are going to potentially face as well is with the Gulf Stream, as the temperatures rise and the currents change, is that suddenly we will lose the Gulf Stream. It will move further south. And so the temperature at this latitude will suddenly drop to what it is every other latitude without the Gulf Stream. So what's really interesting at the minute, and I'm involved with a lot of these conversations, is yes, we've got to increase trajectory. We can see that, but should we actually be planting more and more trees from Southern Europe, expecting these to continuously increase? Or what about when we have this dip, if the Gulf Stream moves, how are woodlands going to respond to that? Obviously, we've got soil health, and we could spend days just talking about mycorrhizal networks, etc., and the flow of nutrients within soils. We've got a couple of really challenging examples at the minute in terms of trees. We've got ash dieback, we've got sudden oak death. So again, if you've got woodland that's predominantly oak, that's predominantly ash, then you need to consider what happens if those pests and diseases get to my woodland. So we can think about how a variation, diversity of different species can increase the resilience of a woodland. You can obviously also think about the sustainability of the resources that you can pull from that. And you can think about, for example, are you managing a sweet chestnut stand? And you're looking to fell those, or you've got a coppice, for example. What are the different products that you can be pulling out of that space? But also just the access and utility of it. So Mike was mentioning just before we started that he'd visited NEP, the huge rewilding estate. So for them, whilst they're increasing biodiversity, they're looking at climate change and soil health, pests and diseases, sustainability and resource, they're also thinking about the utility of it as a tourist attraction. Well, that makes it sound a bit cynical, as an educational attraction and resource as well. So just the very physical structure of a woodland is something we can consider and look at. Is it changing, and do we want it to make a change? So briefly about woodland structure. When we're looking at how things are changing over time, we might notice that we've got a woodland that was planted on one particular day. And so we have a very, very narrow age structure. So we perhaps find that all of the trees have been in competition, they're growing up nice and straight, which is obviously fantastic for timber. But if we're wanting something of a richer biodiversity, if we're wanting something that's more pleasant utility-wise to actually be in there, then we want to have a varied age structure. So one of the successions or ways of looking at succession is we can think about the woodland structure. We have an established canopy. If within 50 to 100 years, those trees are going to mature out and they're going to start felling, what is then going to happen over the following 50 to 100 years? So we can start to think about, can we create a succession whereby, yes, there'll be a gap, but can we start to narrow that gap between the canopy layer dying off and an understory then becoming that canopy? And likewise with the shrub layer and with the field layer, we can consider what is happening, how are things changing? Do we have a field layer which is making it difficult for any tree to grow? In which case, how do we change that? And I'm going to provide some examples of that. And we can also think about the scale of that succession. So, for example, you may own a small woodland that's part of a much larger woodland, and there's a general change. There may be something like ash dieback has gotten in, and you're seeing that the dominant ash is starting to really suffer. And within the next 20, 30 years, you're going to have to probably look at heavy management with that. And that's something that's been going on in other woodland compartments around you. You could also look at it from a site habitat perspective. So maybe you've got a bit of grassland, maybe a bit of heathland, for example, as well as some woodland. What is happening in terms of the relationship between those different habitats, and what's happening within them? Are the habitats actually changing themselves internally, as well as how do they relate to other habitats nearby? And then you've got species mixes. So again, it could be that you've got some birch woodland, some pioneer woodland, and that's giving way to other species starting to come in now. And as we'll look, succession can be really positive and go in the direction that we want it to. It could be counterproductive. It's very much a case of looking at it in context. So within the context of the bigger landscape, within the context of the habitats, the species mix can make sense, or it can actually be counterproductive to what we're trying to do. So again, when we look at succession, it's very much trying to understand how the relationships work, as well as what's happening within each particular area. Sorry. So these are the 5 succession approaches. And I've used the language I use when I teach forestry students this, because the point of this is to make it nice and simple and to not use overly technical language. Okay, so the first one. You can be starting succession. So here we're beginning a whole new process. We've decided what we have now. We want to change that. Okay, so it could be a complete going back to blank canvas, or you could be starting the blank canvas, or you're doing something that's going to significantly alter the direction of it. So the perfect example is you literally have some grass and you then go and plant some trees in it. Okay, so you're starting the succession from grassland to woodland. Okay, so here you're looking at what is the process that actually might play out over decades, if not centuries, that you're starting, that's going to fundamentally redefine that land in terms of the habitat that exists on it. Okay, so like I said, tree planting is the sort of textbook management example of this. But you could also look at how could we start succession in terms of starting a new management direction. So we might have an established area. Let's say we're in a high water table area. We've got lots of alder, and you may decide actually we're dominated by alder here. We'd really like to start getting willow in and amongst all of this. And you might be doing that on the basis of willow's got a really high invertebrate value. Alder's got a pretty good value too, but let's have that variety. And if there's a pest that comes in that attacks alder, then at least you've got some secondary species in there to maintain an ecosystem of sorts. So here you could be starting to say, right, we're going to start thinning out some of this alder, maybe towards the riverside or the lakeside, wherever it is. And we're actually then going to be planting in some willow, or you might have some willow upstream. and you're going to cut back the older to create a space for it to start to extend and to self-set itself. So the difference between obviously tree planting and self-set, if you are starting that succession, obviously it's time. But there are pros and cons to each one of those. So if you were to plant a tree and you were to plant a whole number of trees around it, we could actually end up with the problem that I used as an example previously, which is they all grow up, they're all the same age, there isn't a varied age structure. Now, if you wanted to have that varied age structure and planting is the way in which you're going to go about it, then you'd be looking to have sort of 15, 20 years of successive planting in order to create that varied age structure. Now, obviously with willow, for those of you that don't know, willow is so easy to propagate. You can literally cut a stick, assuming it's the right time of year and the right kind of stick, but you can cut a stick, stick it in wet ground, and it will grow into another willow tree. So, there are species where they sort of lend themselves to being propagated over time. For others, if we were going to try and do something around oak, there's that lovely saying, oak takes 200 years to grow, 200 years to live, and 200 years to die. And that's for a reasonably young one. So there you're looking at, a really, really prolonged planting commitment if you're wanting to, by design, create a varied age structure. So, like I said, with starting succession, you're really looking at what is a new direction we're going to be taking on here, whether that's grassland to woodland, could be taking, stand of hazel and choosing to actually turn it into coppice. That is a significant change in what that habitat is at the moment. It's becoming a working rotation coppice. So essentially, we're applying a new way of working in that site. We're creating a new habitat. So we could say we're starting succession. And an example I'm going to show you later on, there's an area just near me whereby there's conifer woodland that's been there for, I don't know, 40, 50 years. They're now looking at actually, we want to start a succession whereby those are removed and we get some broadleaf colonization. So they're going to be removing the coppice. It's a little stand in and amongst a big broadleaf woodland, and allow over time for the local broadleaves to set themselves down into that themselves. So they're not going to be planting it. They're going to allow that longer time period to actually be the succession. Okay, so starting it, it's already happening, so we could encourage it. So this is recognizing how one space is changing over time and looking with observation very carefully how that species mix or the structure of the woodland is changing and how can we accelerate that process. Okay, so it could be, for example, we've got a stand of, let's say, sycamore. Okay, we've got a stand of sycamore, and the idea of clear felling all of the sycamore, because you do like the idea of, perhaps having some alder and willow down in the wetter areas, getting some oak going, maybe some birch, who knows. You like this idea of a richer, more diverse woodland with a different species mix. To obviously think about cutting, clear felling all of the sycamore that you've got on this site would leave the site bare for many, 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 many years. So from a purely utility point of view, you can recognize that there's a few birch starting to set themselves in. We will just now start to take out a few sycamore, start to recognize where those sycamore are sending out their own little seedlings, start putting those up, and just help that very slow transition from the birch coming into that woodland and starting to take over, and the sycamore giving way. You could actually help accelerate that process by some species-specific thinning. You could also, for example, if you've got hazel, you've got a coppice or something of that nature, you could actually extend that. The hazel will obviously be dropping hazelnuts, and you will get some hazel starting to grow, but you could help that by propagating it, which is a fascinating process. Not quite as easy as cutting a piece of willow, but if you were to take a hazel stem, lay it into the ground, make sure it's anchored at its tip, it will then set down roots and grow into another hazel tree. So there's lots of different ways that you can recognize what's going to be perhaps a very slow process if we would leave it to natural processes, and looking at how could we help encourage that transition. Where do we need to do a little bit of thinning here? Where can we do a bit of encouragement there, and allow the space to physically extend itself and right over what the habitat was previously. So again, if we've got just a grass field, for example, we've got some grassland, recognizing that actually there is some acorn being dropped, there are some oaks coming up, but you'd like to again encourage that process. So you could just start doing some complementary planting with some other oaks, but very different from saying, right, we're going to plant the whole field, to we can now see some self-set oaks starting on this edge. We're going to start adding to their numbers a little bit over time, and we'll kind of almost let that self-set dictate the pace to a certain extent. And we won't extend much beyond where those trees are establishing naturally anyway. So starting the succession is, as the name suggests, we're beginning a process here, or we're significantly altering one. Encouraging it is where we recognize what's already happening and looking at how we can help that process, whether that's a little bit of thinning, whether it's a little bit of complementary planting. But we're trying to kind of bring the timescales down a little bit so that we can actually see change happening in a relatively short space of time. The next one is stopping it. So heathland is a perfect example of this. So this is where we realize that there's heathland and we're getting lots of birch seed set and saplings coming up. And if we were to allow this to continue, we're going to lose the heathland. It's going to be overly covered by trees. That's going to enrich the soils, and then those soils being too rich for the heather and for the gorse, etc., it's going to be taken over by other species and so on and so forth. So, as the name suggests, with stopping, we say, right, we can see this process happening. We can see, it's the example I've got here, we've got some sweet chestnut, and we can see the hollies encroaching, and it's getting thicker and thicker, and each year we can see new hollies pioneering into this space. Well, the first thing we can do then is decide, well, do we want that to happen? And if the answer is no, then we can stop it. So this is where we start drawing a line in the sand and saying, in terms of this habitat here and how this habitat is encroaching on it, we're going to make sure that it doesn't go any further from this. So in heathland, we'd say, right, this is the tree edge, this is the woodland edge. Any tree that's beyond this, we're going to be removing. So we're holding it at that tree line, okay? With the holly example, it could be that over time, you don't really notice it until you kind of think back in your memories to, oh, there used to be a path over there we used to walk, and we can't even see it now. So you may decide, right, from this point, we're going to stop it. And essentially what you then need to do is you then need to have an annual check to see, what is happening, how are things changing, what do we need to do now to make sure that we're holding things as they are. So essentially what you're doing is you're pressing pause on all of the different kinds of succession that might be happening. And then your management commitment is very much then about how do we maintain things as they are. And you'll see this a lot. You'll see this a lot, for example, when you go to any urban space, any urban green space. The trees are managed to be a certain shape. Anything that's self-set, any seedlings, they'll probably get mowed down because the grass is managed. And essentially what we end up is a terrible biodiversity space, but fantastic for utility. So in urban green spaces, you see this emphasis obviously on how can local residents use this space, and the biodiversity to a certain extent doesn't really get a look in. Things are getting better in that regard, but not necessarily fantastic at the moment. So essentially what they've done is they have started a succession at one point. It was just a field perhaps. They planted some trees, they have grown, and then at a suitable point they decided that this is what we want. We're now going to freeze it in time, and each year quite a considerable amount of time and effort and funds is going to go into maintaining it exactly like it is. And with a woodland, particularly if that's part of a larger woodland, you might have caveats. You might have groups that you're part of where there might be something in your particular area, or a few members might have woodland compartments that have a particular species, which others might not wish to have. So again, holly is one of those. It's one of those species that I've been to so many different places, and it's become an issue because what is a perfectly viable, beautiful tree obviously gets incredibly thick and shades out other species and becomes a space where no one can venture into it. And if you've got 1 or 2 acres and this is a very precious space for you to go and use, whether you're producing products or not from it, just for you in terms of your enjoyment, then obviously you don't want to lose the footprint of it. You want to be able to enjoy as much of it as possible. Um, and so holly can be one of those problems that once it gets in, and if it's allowed to really take hold, you've got a big problem there. And obviously the first point is to then stop it. And that's drawing the line in the sand and saying, we're going to freeze things as they are for now. So we can start, we can encourage, we can stop. The fourth one is reverse. So this is where we try to revert the habitat backwards in time, okay, to a previous state. So again, heathland is a really good illustration for this. There's several heathlands that I've worked on over the years where, again, the tree line has encroached on them. And it's about firstly halting that progress, stopping that succession from heathland into pioneer woodland, and then reversing it so that what was transitioning into woodland has now been returned to good, healthy heathland. And then once you've reversed it back to a tree line, you then stop it again. So this is where you start to jump between different forms of succession. So once you've reversed it back to a tree line where you've got the heathland back that you need, you can then stop it again. And the way in which you maintain it, the way that you have stopped that succession, is that you have cattle grazing it, for example. So that's one of the ways that, if anyone's familiar with Beacon Hill in Leicestershire, I used to be a countryside ranger there. We had lowland heathland, and one of the decisions that was made was that to try and get back the heathland to really good state, we need to recreate it the way it was created originally. So you have highland heathlands where all of the nutrients are washed down, with lowland heathlands where there's a lot of nutrients already. A lot of the time that came about by design, which was grazing. And so there was 16 or so lowland cattle that were chosen, longhorn cattle, sorry. And these longhorn cattle would roam around, eating up all of the scrub, eating up all the pioneer species that was set up, mainly birch. And we would see the heather come back more and more each year. And just as a little aside, to the point whereby we can actually see in the heather where there were some old earthworks, which you could never see in the scrub. So we actually found an old cattle crush. And I always love the sort of irony of it. I think it's irony, whereby the cattle helped us discover the cattle crush from, thousands of years previously. So it could be that with that holly encroachment, let's go back to that example, you've managed to get on top of it, you've stopped it from taking over the rest of the woodland, but then you decide, actually, we'd like to get it back. We've lost, let's say, a third of an acre with this. Let's start cutting that back. And then obviously that's a more intense process. So whenever you're trying to reverse a natural process, you're obviously working uphill slightly in many respects. So you're trying to undo the entire previous period of succession. And if something's been left, obviously, the longer it's left, the more work there is to do. But again, it's about recognizing, okay, so we're targeting a certain species here, or we're targeting a certain structure. So, for example, if we've got an understory of sycamore that's incredibly heavy, and obviously with sycamore, it pinches together really nicely. They knit together very nicely. There's another story, and they can shade out. They lower the light levels, which obviously then changes the flora species that you will find underneath that. You know? So it could be like, right, we're going to open this woodland back up again. This was a nice open beach in oak woodland previously. So we've stopped the sycamore going any further. We're pulling up the saplings that are arising each year. So now we need to reverse it. So now we need to start doing some targeted sycamore thinning to roll back the time to it being that oak beach open woodland again. And so it's about recognizing where are you taking it back to. So that could be a physical feature in the landscape. That could be taking it back to a tree line in terms of peatland. It could be that actually sycamore haven't really been reported in this area as of 30 years ago. It's now taking over. So we're sort of taking it back 30 years. So it could be a physical line in the ground. It could be a particular time period. But whatever approach you're taking, you essentially try to take it back to a previous state. And then, like I said, you're then stopping the succession. So you're going from reversing to stopping. And the final one is the easiest. You're allowing it. So this is where you recognize that there's a change that's occurring, and you've decided that either you don't have the resources to do it, or actually it's something that you want. So it could be, for example, that you've got some pioneer woodland and you start to notice that there's more oak coming in. You start to notice that there's other species, for example, there's alder and willow, and you've maybe got some gilder rose and some dog rose taking hold as well. And the diversity of the woodland is naturally broadening, and that's what you want. In which case, the management for this is have a cup of tea and a biscuit and enjoy that process. But also, obviously, recognizing that there are things that you will need to take stock of in terms of assessment. So this is about allowing the process, but not being too blasé about it, and recognizing as well within the context of maybe your woodland and then amongst everybody else's, what is that going to mean for other people? Yeah, so you might love sycamore. You might like a really dark, shaded, slightly damp woodland for whatever reason. No judgment here. But are your next door neighbours going to really like to have all this sycamore that's growing up that you've allowed to happen? How are they going to feel about all of the seeds settling into their lands, and obviously then dealing with all of the sycamore risings as well? But essentially, yes, allowing it is a fantastic opportunity, and sometimes it's the lesser of many evils. So one area that I'm working in at the moment, there's a huge amount of ash dieback, and there's not a lot that can really be done about it. There's huge efforts in terms of recognizing where a tree is being affected by it, and this is in rural and very urban areas. Dealing with them as they get into stage 3 and 4, and they start to become maybe a little bit dangerous, because obviously there's residents and pedestrians nearby, and essentially allowing that succession of the ash to die off. And then eventually, hopefully during that whole process, which is going to be maybe 20, 30 years, is to recognize, are there maybe some resilient strains? Are some of the ash able to deal with this disease? Or if not, we kind of lose the ash within the area. Once the disease has kind of worked its way out, we then start reversing succession, whereby we start to then plant ash and restock that back. That's a decision for the future. At the minute, we're recognizing that we really can't stop the ash dieback. So we're allowing the succession to happen, and then we'll respond accordingly in the future. And so when we do that, we'll then be repopulating. So we're starting succession back. So this is a woodland. It's actually literally just down the road from me, where within the woodland, we've actually got all of the different succession approaches being used. So I'll start up on the top left with the purple area. So this is a field, or Oh, just realised the spelling mistake there. This is a field that was cut. It was a sports field. They've allowed it to become natural grassland now. And what they are doing is they're allowing a small marshy area, which they constantly try to drain. They're allowing that marshy area to actually establish itself. And obviously all of the flora and fauna that will enjoy that. And so here, this is a process where they're allowing that succession to happen. They're observing it, they're seeing what happens. And at some point, let's say, for example, they realize that they could actually extend marshland a little bit, then they're going to switch into a different kind of succession. Here, they're maybe going to be encouraging it. They're going to start cutting up and allowing the land to take in more water than it currently is. They might block off some of the drainage that's happening. So again, it sort of backfills and becomes more marshland. But at the minute, they're just allowing that to happen. In the blue area, they're encouraging a broader diversity by selectively thinning out certain species. So in that particular area, the what is it they've got in there? Oh, it's birch they've got in there at the moment. So this is birch pioneer woodland. And what they're doing is they're recognizing that we've got other things coming in. There's rowan, there's elder, I think there's dog rose. And what they're doing is essentially just thinning out a bit of the birch woodland. For those of you that aren't familiar with pioneer birch woodland, it's usually very, very dense, to give these other species an opportunity to gain a foothold in the area. In the orangey areas, they're stopping succession. So this is grassland that's constantly having seed dropped into it from nearby trees. And so what they're doing is they go in and they cut back and take out any saplings that are coming up to maintain those areas as grassland. In the red area, they're reversing some woodland. So this is coppice, hazel coppice, that has been left to just mature up for 30, 35 years or so, is my guess looking at it. And so structurally, it's now developing a high canopy. And so to reverse it means to go back to the active rotation coppice that was once there. And so we're actually bringing the structure of the woodland back down to shrub layer rather than having an established canopy. And then the sort of whitey creamy colour, they're starting succession. So this is where you've got some conifers that have been, or the local sort of the myth is that they were planted by a ranger who wanted Christmas trees and was just left. But they've decided, you know, this is not an appropriate place to have a conifer plantation in the middle of this broadleaf woodland with, you know, hopefully some historical coppice that's going to be brought back into active rotation coppice. And so we need to start a succession here of getting this to become broadleaf woodland. And so what's going to be happening there over the next few years is that they'll be thinning that out, clear felling it eventually, the areas around to populate that. So to the south, I think from memory, there's a bit of birch, but a lot of the talk at the moment is about using the coppice woodland and propagating it to the south, so that at least some of that area will be taken up by the new coppice. Okay, so in summary, breaking the woodland down into these different compartments, based on a particular habitat, for example, grassland, heathland, pond. The species mix, we've got oak with beech, or we've got birch with alder and a bit of willow, but also the structure. So it could be we've got an established canopy and a nice age structure, or we've got a big canopy with not much underneath. It just allows you to be able to prioritize what it's trying to do in that area. And like I say, try to reduce all of the complexity and uncertainty to try and create a clear picture for what it is you're trying to achieve. And so one of the things obviously you can do with that is you can recognize, am I allowing a natural, or am I trying to freeze it? Or in fact, am I trying to reverse it? And then it also helps feed into, and I understand then how this is going to link in with either maintaining or increasing the biodiversity, the overall health. If you have a really nice, diverse range of species, the health of the woodland is going to be much greater, the sustainability of it. But again, also coming back to the utility. So whether that's something that you're producing, whether you have a hazel coppice and you're looking to produce things that you can sell, or whether the utility of it is enjoyment that you get out of that space. By thinking about different forms of succession, it can help you recognize how you can maintain and or improve that for yourselves. Okay, so yes, like I said earlier on, I'm an ethno-ecologist. That's my website. There are lots of different posts on there, some of which I'm sure will bore you to tears, but some of them you might find interesting in terms of looking at different ecosystems, looking at how we manage things, and looking at how, which is a particular interest of mine, we can get local communities involved with that whole process as well.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay, what time are we on? Oh, look at that, almost, yeah.
Yeah,
Right, I'm going
bang
to
on.
take this off just so I can see people.
Oh, that's better. Well, I started this webinar in a
I know,
t-shirt
I know.
and I've ended up in a fleece,
There we
so that's the autumn has happened. So we've got some questions here. Shall I
go.
read them out and then you answer them, Paul?
Yeah, sounds good.
Cool. Okay. Well, so Phil says, I have a lot of ash dieback. Which species would be the best to plant to replace them?
So it really depends on the rest of your site, where it is, what the soil type is, what's
Mm,
around it and things like that. If you were, yeah, it's hard to give advice without knowing the specifics of a site, you see. Um, if you want to, type in the chat box, give me a few details about where you are and what's around you, and I could perhaps give you some examples.
if only we knew someone who wrote woodland management plans.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
You're going to be very careful as well because if I was to say, oh, I'm going to choose something which I wouldn't say now. Elder is great, for example. It grows just like ash. Then you go and you plant a bunch of that. 50 years from now, someone is going, why on earth were they planting an elder here?
Yeah.
So I was very cautious about giving recommendations without really knowing the details of a site.
Yeah, that's good. Smart. Because this will be immortalized in YouTube with my 60 followers. Um, any advice on dealing with the effects of deer and squirrels in relation to succession?
So the first thing that comes to mind is what the extent of it is. So obviously you've got everything from, they're there and you will see the occasional little bit of damage through to, in certain parts of the country, it's hard to plant trees, even with guards, etc., because there are so many deer roaming around having a nibble, frankly. So again, context is really, really important. If they're in there and they're doing some damage, I think for me personally, that's part of the natural world. All of the damage that they're doing, in one sense, is actually fantastic microhabitats for something else. So yes, they might be gnawing at some bark and you're getting some deadwood in there, but then you're obviously getting invertebrates that can go and live in that deadwood, off that deadwood. The old sort of points to start thinking about responsibilities is where it's coming into the point and what might then start falling over and who might be impacted on that. Quite literally.
Yeah. Katerina says that she has trouble with squirrel numbers around hers, and the recommended way to reduce them. Katerina, if you want to look on our YouTube, we've got a webinar from last year from the UK Squirrel Accord. I think you might find some answers in there. And if anybody knows any other good ways, please type in.
My view on this is
the advice was that to do with reducing their fertility. That was only in the research stage, so that's not available yet.
Right. Okay. Were you at that webinar?
I don't think so, but I've heard about it.
Yeah, they were talking about the yeah, reducing their fertility to as a way to stop it, which sounds good, but
It is generally really interesting when you look at the conversations of all of the different conversations that are happening about species reintroduction, etc., etc. There doesn't seem to be quite the same level of passion, I think, about bringing back the red squirrel, and all the work that's there to do for that, obviously. But it's sort of a case of, well, we'll never get rid of the greys now. I think if we start to try really hard in a concerted fashion, I think we'll be surprised at the inroads we can make to bring in the red squirrel back. But yeah, there's a general sort of malaise of there's too many Americans over here.
Yeah.
So that's it. That's a lot.
yeah, I like to think of them. They take like bits of bark off. I like to think of them as like sampling tapas from every tree, just breaking trees. That's how I think of it.
Yeah.
Need some pine martins. So Mark says, I'm planting broadleaf trees in former agricultural grassland. Should I be thinking about what is happening in the soils? Maybe bringing in dead wood to help the soil shift to a more woodland soil type.
So assuming that you haven't learned or inherited this land from a very organically minded farmer, then there's possibly all kinds of different treatments that's going to have been put into that soil to maximize output. So yes, you're probably looking at dealing with quite denuded soils. And so as much as possible, if you can start to bring in biomass that's local provenance, that's in some kind of form where it can actually break down. So if you talk to local tree surgeons, for example, with everything that they have to manage, they either have to burn it or turn it into a product they can sell, etc., etc. So if you can get local tree surgeons to drop off anything that's local provenance, because obviously we want to think about the mycorrhizal, fungal bodies as well. Dump it on the site, that could start to break down. Even leaf matter as well. So you can start to bring in invertebrates with that. But yeah, anything that's organic that locally you can get your hands on, start putting it around the site. That'll start to obviously break down, put nutrients back into the soil. If you get some fungal bodies in there, which you probably will without even trying, if you're bringing in stuff locally, obviously that can start the decomposing part, and then you're maybe going to be in a lot better position, certainly than if you just start off from scratch and don't put that time in.
Yeah, thank you. I have Alison says that she's got a Scots pine plantation in the Cairngorms National Park. It's habitat for endangered. I can't say that word. Help me out, Alison. Capercaillie.
Oh, clearly.
Capercaillie.
Capercaillie.
Okay, thanks. Is succession still encouraged into this kind of habitat?
Well, that would fall under the you're stopping succession. So you want it as it is, essentially. And like I say, back when we used to have woodlands that would, and obviously Scotland is an example where they still have a lot of this opportunity, but even still, there's so much woodland that was always going through some kind of succession, and the communities, the fauna communities could move with that as well. Nowadays, we've got less and less opportunity to happen. So it could be, yes, that woodland, if it's protected and it's incredibly important for the Capercaillie, that you want to keep it as it is. They are happy, so let's keep them happy.
Pop quiz, everyone. In the 5 stages of succession, if this one is stopping it, what stage is that out of the 5? 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? Anyone know? I'm just showing off that I made notes. It's number 3. Katerina, every field maple and birch gets severely damaged. Young sycamore also. So we're talking about these grey squirrels again. Yeah. Need some pine marten.
I was talking to, sorry, this is going to be a real name drop moment now. I was chatting with Chris Packard recently, and we were talking about different species preferring different kinds of bark. We were talking about deer eating yew bark and things like this. And I got a theory that squirrels particularly like eating sycamore field maple, and birch because of the sugars.
Yeah.
So sycamore, field maple, obviously maples. You can make maple syrup from it. So one of the things I do a lot of with my ethnoecology is I try to make the natural world more accessible by teaching traditional ecological knowledge. So teach how to make maple syrup, which you can do from the kind of, I know I badmouth it a lot, but you can make it from sycamore. You have to collect a lot to get very little. But birch is a phenomenal source of sugar. So at the earliest stages of spring, before there's any sign on the tree itself, you can collect the sap that's pumping quite vigorously and boil that down into a sugar syrup. So what you have to do there is you have to go and look at something like a hazel. And the old traditional saying is, when the bud on a hazel swells, but it grows to the size of a squirrel's thumb, that's the time to go and harvest the birch sap,
A
because there'll
squirrel's
be nothing
thumb.
on the birch tree
Cute.
itself to give you the sign. Yeah.
Mhm.
So they do have a use, which is we can find out how big their thumbs are and how big a hazel bud needs to be, and then we can go and harvest the birch sap. So yeah, my theory around squirrels and how they particularly predate on those barks is the sugar content.
Well, from
If anyone
squirrel's
knows anything
thumbs,
different, I don't know.
sorry, we're talking about squirrel's thumbs. I'm more worried about your toe, Paul, because you dropped that name. So I hope it's okay. Where did you meet Chris Packham in real life?
There's some conference somewhere. Yeah,
Cool. Very cool.
I met Michaela Strachan actually recently, and I meet him again on Friday. So yeah,
2/3 of the
there's
Really
another
Wild
conference.
show there. You're impressing me even more. Do you do anything positive about encouraging the mycorrhizal fungi for new plantings?
Yeah, there's a really fascinating research paper actually. It's a little bit dated now, and I'm sure there's many others. I just haven't been able to keep up with it really. Looking at how within tree nurseries, which is something that we're starting at the moment, you can actually bring in local flora, rotting logs and things like this, into the tree nursery to help it start to develop mycorrhizal networks so that those trees are a little bit, or more so than they would be normally, tied in to the local subtleties in terms of chemical interactions. And then when you plant them out, the research paper was suggesting that actually they then tend to do far better. But like I was saying to the other person that was asking about, working on agricultural land, if you start going to the sites immediately around, so literally local provenance, and start, taking just handfuls of leaf matter, bits of soil, bits of, fallen log that are rotting down, and you bring them into your site, more than likely you're going to be carrying in some of the local mycorrhizal networks as well, which will then hopefully propagate. And I have read a good piece of research as well, which says if you find rotting logs with fungi on, and then if you dig a small trench, put the logs in and just cover them over with a little bit of soil, that is an additional way of really helping the mycorrhizal fungi start to set out into the soils.
Right.
I would have thought of that.
Yeah.
Where are we? I'm glad that we're all talking about fungi, by the way, because it's UK National Fungus Day on the October the 5th. And if you keep your eye out on Eventbrite, we've got a couple of fungus related events. So please keep looking for that. What factors would you consider when deciding how quickly to remove conifers, clear fell or gradual removal over decades?
So again, context is king here. So the questions I would be asking is, how many are we talking here? What is the local habitat like? So for example, is it just a random stand of conifers that someone planted for some, timber aspirations that didn't follow through? Or, is it, similar all the way around the area and you're wanting to convert it into some broadleaf? So yeah, there's lots of different questions there. And also, for example, what age structure they're at. So are they actually starting to mature out? Are you getting to your 50, 60, 70 year kind of mark? Or are they 20, 30 years? That's an important question as well. But also a very practical question is, what level do you have the capacity to deal with that management? So can you physically get someone or have someone, or you yourself can do that felling? And then what happens to the timber afterwards? So if it's, viable timber stock, you could look at maybe getting a contractor in to do a clear fell, given, you know, all the other conditions being that, you know, it's not actually part of the local ecosystem, it's a random crop, for example. But also then thinking about utility, if you're using the woodland and you don't want to suddenly be, you know, you own a field all of a sudden with some tree stumps, and you don't want to have that 20, 30-year delay before you've got tree cover again, that could lend itself to maybe thinking about doing a gradual removal.
Bill has responded. You asked for some more information for context before you could give an answer. So he's described his woodland. So thanks, Paul. My woodland is former agricultural grassland planted 30 years ago with 30% ash plus oak, birch, alder, rowan, hazel, bird cherry, and beech. Some willow has also self-seeded and got a few aspen and holly to increase biodiversity. Any suggestions on species to replace the ash would be appreciated.
Structurally, alder would probably be quite good. Depends how much of the site is suitable for alder. If you're going to lose, what do you say, it was 30% ash? I wouldn't necessarily worry. So if I do a 30% thin on a woodland, we kind of see that as a refresh.
Yeah.
If it was 40 to 50%, you're obviously going to have quite a significant impact there. But I would say with 30% ash, looking at how that's maybe going to naturally, you know, denude and get removed over time, yeah, you could allow the alder to self-seed a little bit. The birch certainly will. And again, it's whether you're happy with having more predominant birch and or alder in the woodland. Yeah, I hope that's useful. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure Phil will find that useful. So we've got somebody saying they've taken down 6 enormous dieback trees this year, and not only have enough firewood rounds to last decades, but also mountains of wood chips to provide nutrient support for 20 new plantings that he undertakes each year. Don't let your tree surgeon take it away. Thanks for the advice there.
Try and get as much from local tree surgeons as possible. I used to do this at forest school. I used to say to practitioners, you know, if you have a corner of a field and frankly, you've had a big enough battle trying to convince the caretaker not to mow the grass in that area, then what you can do is start contacting local tree surgeons saying, look, if it's local, obviously if it's, you know, not poisonous or anything like that, feel free to come and drop it off. We'll use it for kids to climb on. It'll just rot down and enrich the area. You know, it's so fantastic. I mean, the key thing again is just local provenance. You know, if you're going beyond, well, I'd be probably pretty hardcore myself and say 5 miles, but certainly 10 miles. If you're going more than 10 miles away, then I would probably say no. But if it's within size, in that space, then yeah, bring it to the site, drop it off.
Oh, cool. So here we've got a question about advice for accelerating reduction in bracken on bracken dominated, formerly overgrazed upland. Good natural regeneration of rowan, birch and limited oak already, and now supplementing with additional planting. My hope is twice yearly cut early and late summer will help, and over time shading and water demand from trees will weaken the bracken. But please, any advice welcome.
Napalm is pretty good for bracken. Yeah, I mean, bracken is designed, I think, by an evil genius. Yeah, I think the best thing, because obviously, you know, I don't recommend you know, using chemicals and things, is to take a long, slow approach to it. So you've got a natural regeneration by the sound of it. If you're doing some, I think you said you're doing some supplementary planting as well, so you're encouraging that succession. Yes, the bracken is going to tolerate the shade. Obviously, it likes to do that quite a lot. But if you've got some, did they say they've got some grazing in there?
I'm scrolling away now. Overgrazed. It was formerly overgrazed upland.
It was overgrazed initially. Yeah. So yeah, with the trees drawing away some nutrients, some water, with the natural process of decomposition, enriching the soil, you would hopefully start to get a more varied flora at the field level over time. But it is going to be a very, very slow process.
Mhm. Final question.
It sounds like from everything I can hear. Right.
Thank you. The final question we'll take is from Nikki, and it's just a newbie question, which we welcome. Is birch ever used for coppice?
No.
Birch will coppice. I've always found it's quite stubborn, as in some will and some won't. And I've never been able to figure out why some do and some don't. There are lots of research papers which, you know, I'm sure someone could really get into, and maybe this kind of thing has been discovered. I think it's, and this is just a hunch of mine, I think it's about when you start the coppicing. I think you need to start it later than you normally would. So for example, a hazel, or even a willow, you know, you give it 2 to 3 years, maybe 5 at an outset, and you can start coppicing it. I think with a birch, you need to give it a good 10, 15 years to really establish itself, then coppice it, or try to coppice it. And I think, and this is going off a hunch of me thinking back to all the times we've done it, I think you find more success when you've let it really establish its root system. I think the birch is much more reliant on the roots than we sometimes give it credit for, because it's such a pioneer, quick species that grows. So with the hazel and the willow, they can set down roots really quickly and get going. I think the birch really needs its roots to be really, really in the ground, in the soil, getting the nutrients it wants before then you cut it. And also a really early winter cut. That's another hunch that I'm working on at the minute, that I'm trying to find out if that's true. So rather than leaving it until obviously, you know, later in the season or just before the growing season starts, earliest in the winter season that you can, in the dormant season you can cut it, then I think from memory, you're a lot more likely to get some good growth back. And again, if anyone else here knows different, please share that, because it's something I'm trying to figure out at the minute.
So, well, we've got 8,000 people in the SWOG Facebook group, so we can ask, and somebody might know.
8,000. Well,
I think so, last count. So, listen, Paul, thank you so much. It's a big squirrel, tiny squirrel thumbs up from me. It's you've really done us proud tonight. Thank you for filling the hour with just jam-packed with so much knowledge. I think if we play our cards right, you'll probably come back and do another talk for us in the future. I think we've got one penciled in the diary, haven't we?
I was going to say, I think I've already volunteered myself for one. So.
Yeah, I think we've got February booked up. So please, everybody, look out for Paul in the future. As always, we've got our events on Eventbrite. So please take a look. Keep an eye out in the SWOG newsletter, which comes out on the 1st of the month. And is it the 1st of the month or the very last day of the month, Mary?
Is it the first?
The first, I was right. I should have gone. Yeah. I should have been confident. And Paul, on your website, we will include it in our upcoming newsletter, because I know that you offer a lot of courses and you've got loads of great stuff going on. Just the website in general is actually very interesting. I spent quite a lot of time reading it this afternoon as well. So yeah, please can everybody check out, is it paulmoseley.com?
.org.
And have a look at the courses and see what he can teach you via there. So thank you so much for your time, Paul. And yeah, we've all really enjoyed it, and the thanks are coming flooding in. Everybody's very appreciative. So thank you so much. And I will record this and I will disseminate it. I'll send it. And if you send me the slides, Paul, I can send it out to people as and when they ask.
No problem.
Thank you so much. Cheerio, everybody. Thank you for always supporting
Bye-bye.
SWOG. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.